Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hello and welcome back to the Low Carb MD podcast. Today, Tro, we have the guy who always messes up our audio and video and messes up our podcast all the time, but he's a pretty dang nice guy. And I begged him to come on because he has some great info, and he took a strong stand on a lot of this COVID stuff when the rest of us were cowering. And I personally didn't want to make a comment. So Tro, how are you doing, man?
Listen, very happy to be here. Another follicularly challenged brethren right here. So very happy to have him. But brilliant guy, smart guy, been talking a lot about metabolic health and infectious disease, kind of examining the outcomes of Sweden and comparing that to its neighbors and asking critical questions. I think that's the most important thing, asking critical questions, super excited to have Ivor Cummins on, the Fat Emperor.
Ivor, the Emperor's here and he has clothes on, so that's awesome. Ivor, welcome, man. Good to see you, brother.
Great stuff. Great. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Tro. Yeah, great to be here. Always.
Well, share your wisdom with us. We just had Paul Mason on. I heard your podcast with him and it was outstanding. And I said, man, we got to get him on too. And so, what you're talking about is stuff that no one is really addressing. And whatever you want to talk about from a COVID standpoint, would love to. One of the things that I'm intrigued by is the vitamin D data and how that ties into metabolic health, and also the whole thing about sequestering, staying at home. All Tro's friends stayed at home, and 66% of their admissions are from the people that were at home getting infected by their family members. So I'm curious, I know you took a stand saying, hey, this may not be the right thing. And just from asking the question, people were going nuts on you. So I'm wondering, because I didn't want to mess with that topic. So where do you stand now, and what are you thinking, from that standpoint? How do we keep ourselves the safest we can?
Yeah, okay. So we'll start with the whole lockdown versus distancing thing and then get to D and all the rest. So basically, way back 6 weeks ago now, I took a bit of a risk and I had Tucker Goodrich on my show. And he was quite controversial at the time, but he believed in his data. So Tucker's a Wall Street risk manager, so you could say he's pro-economy. But the key thing was he's a crisis manager for over 20 years. So he knows the tempo of these things. Not so much the virology, but these are mathematically complex things. There's lag times, there's a lot of numbers involved, many, many different vectors. So he had worked out from the Italian data, and the Italian situation was really what spooked all of Europe. And he had worked out from the data that the R number, or how much it was replicating through the population, had essentially fallen right down after initial hump. And it had fallen right down that by the time they did a lockdown, if you allowed the lag time for infection and then death, it essentially had come down the curve before the lockdown could actually act. And he was making the point that it was behaving like previous viruses. They've got a natural curve. Some of it relates to immunity. Some of it relates to the most exposed people getting exposed and then expiring, unfortunately. But he just noted that the curve suggested lockdown did not add anything or very little over the distancing policies. So this whole question is not lockdown versus, so we do nothing then and let people die. It's not actually about that. It's about smart distancing, the extent of the distancing measures you take, whether they include masks, all the rest, versus locking down your economy and then causing collateral damage for God knows how long. So that's the compare. So anyway, Tucker went through it and some people weren't happy, but it turns out, and this is very interesting, and people may not be aware of this, so listen closely to the next 60 seconds. So a professor of evidence-based medicine with a team in Oxford University, England, right? No fringe there. Came out nearly 2 weeks ago, analyzed the data for the UK exactly like Tucker did, but with vastly more probably capability and all the team members. And they declared publicly in the Independent in the UK that the distancing had done all of the work. And they showed that the deaths in UK peaked around the 7th or 8th of April, and they can't have come from the lockdown. And they showed the R number. So they showed the same as Tucker. Now, a professor who's a Nobel Prize winner from Stanford came out last week and said the same thing, that he had worked this out from the China data, verified it with the Italian data, and now was convinced that the lockdown added nothing over smart distancing. So that's 2 professors, including a Nobel Prize winner. But there's more. An Israeli professor of mathematics in Israel did an analysis, couldn't explain why in terms of virology, but said that the lockdown is not impacting the curves, the spread, the shape. It's not over distancing, it's not. So now we have 3 professors as well as Tucker and my own instinct on the math I've been looking at, and many more who are writing to me, mathematical people, and they're all saying the same thing. So are we all wrong? Well, maybe we are, but I haven't seen anything in the media or anywhere where anyone else has done analysis to actually show that the lockdown did do something. So everyone's saying it, oh, well, lockdown, obviously, you need to lock down. But they're all just saying it. They're not showing an analysis. So I got 3 professors and many more mathematicians who've done the analysis. And the Koch Institute in Germany essentially came up with an analysis that showed the same thing, that the R value had come down around to 1 from around 2.8 in Germany, but it came down before the lockdown date could impact it. And then it stayed flat since. So people need to internalize that it's not a fringe view to say that lockdown added little beyond smart distancing.
Yeah, the concern,
from the people who've done the analysis, it's actually the majority view at the moment from the people who've actually presented analyses. So that isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and you know the initial analysis were way off on the numbers. They were off by huge factors. You would know the exact numbers. I'm not a scientist guy like you, but they were way up, not even close. And so the concern was we were going to overwhelm our healthcare system and there would be no ventilators and we wouldn't have enough resources. Now, almost every doctor I talk to, Troy, you may have a different perspective out in your coast because you guys got hit hard. All my ER friends are saying, hey, they're laying people off. There's not enough work to be done. The nurses are getting furloughed and people are hurting from a medical perspective instead of being overwhelmed. Where I know there are places where they are, but a lot of people I talk to on the West Coast are saying, yeah, we're not seeing what everyone else is seeing somehow. And so the question becomes, now that we have a surplus of ventilators and we're not overrun, what do we do? I mean, how quickly do we start opening it up and you know, getting back to life?
Well, let me just jump in because I want to give you guys a sense of what it looks like here. Okay, I'm basically around the New York City area. I can, walk to the George Washington Bridge. I'm involved in the Yale, New Haven kind of health system, and I have a lot of colleagues, particularly infectious disease colleagues, working all around New York City, and they are basically seeing about double their ICU admissions are about double what they normally are. Okay, so the amount of ICU patients are about double what they normally are. So the critical cases have gone up. Okay, their total volume of COVID patients, I mean, they have whole floors basically full of COVID patients. But because, I would say that at least out of the Yale system and several New York City hospital systems that I've seen, they have responded so well in preparing. They stopped all the elective procedures. They have surgeons rounding on the floors. They have gastroenterologists rounding on the floors, because they have nothing else to do. They were doing all these procedures. And I think that, the peak probably hit already maybe 2 weeks ago for this area. And it's maybe 4 weeks ago in some of the areas surrounding this area. But New York, New Jersey, Connecticut did see, that ICU these, and not only the ICU numbers. So we're just talking about the numbers, but the acuity, meaning like now they're taking everybody, Brian, they're proning the patients. I mean, this is like something community hospitals would never do. And now community hospitals are like flipping patients over, managing that, like doing everything they can to keep people from being, shipped off to tertiary care centers, so the acuity has gone up. I think that the overall response has been, it's been pretty good. Some of those early measures to, stop the elective procedures were definitely smart. Now the question becomes: did the whole world need to be locked down? I'm not really sure, but at least at this point, let's put it this way: there's a massive amount of discharges. The number of cases are going down. That's where we are right now. So, and these are critical questions. I have to agree. They're absolutely critical questions.
Yeah, so I'd say, Tro, the reaction, fantastic work there by everyone. But interestingly, I'll add another guy to my list. There's so many who are saying the same thing. So I can't recall his name, but in the New York Post a few days ago, maybe a week ago, there was a senior New York doc who's on the front line for the whole thing. And in fairness, he had a great story. But he also in his story said he knows the tempo of these things. And he said that it was pre-lockdown baked in. And he knew by the numbers coming in and the lag times that the lockdown didn't really change the curve. So he's just yet another person. Now, maybe he just has experience of a particular type or a natural talent for the mathematics, but it's yet another person. But I think New York, though, the key question was, why did New York get so hit? And there's a few theories, and they're pretty solid. So New York, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, kept the subways running as you're getting super spread a month or two ago. And I even heard they reduced the number of trains, but that just meant they were more packed. So now you're going to have a viral load thing going on, which is a very real thing, I think. That's not theory. A higher viral load that you take when you're infected can make a big difference in the severity. So that's one thing. And the lockdown, yet again, the lockdown was too late. I think that's what people keep missing. By the time the lockdown occurs, and it feels great, you're doing something big. Hell, you're destroying your economy. That's how much you care. But technically, if it's too late, it doesn't really add anything to the distancing. What do you reckon?
I mean, I just think it's like we're all, it's kind of like backseat driving. You're faced with something terrible and potentially terrible, and what do you do? So I think there's no way to go back, and I guess they can model and try to figure out kind of, was this right, was this wrong, and here we are talking about it. I just don't know what else to do. I'm telling my patients, and we're in a COVID, in my small little practice, we have several cases of COVID. I tell my patients, look, put a mask on, go outside, exercise, get some sun, and not the ones that have COVID. I tell them to isolate, but to my patients, I'm telling them, just take common sense precautions and then try to go about your business without like being stricken by anxiety and thoughts of suicide. I don't know. I just don't know. I tend to tell people, I'm just trying to focus on the people right next to me. Do I know whether society should be locked down? I don't. Do I think my patients should not go on a trail and get exercise, like where there's nobody? I think that they should. I think they should, put a mask on if you really want to do something, and then go outside and walk on a trail, move, get some sunlight, move, eat good food. Right.
Yeah, I would
I
love
don't
to
know.
hear
I'm not smart enough to deal with populations and modeling, and you're talking to all these brilliant people. But it's like, what do we tell the people we care about? What do we tell the patients that I'm dealing with?
Well, I think I think it's a political thing. I think at first you have to look and say, I have to overreact, because if I don't, and a lot of people die, which all the models said they were, you're screwed. You had to overreact. You had no choice. But then at some point you have to reassess. And, I was looking at Florida's data, for instance, compared to New York, and you go, why in the heck are they not getting hammered? They have every senior in the world wants to move to Florida. They have, maybe it's the weather, maybe it's the heat. But what they did is they locked down the nursing homes. They knew that was going to be a problem. So they tested people and they were very strict on the nursing homes. And that's where our highest mortality is by far. There's zero doubt about that. And so they locked it down there and said, okay, let's let everyone carry on for a while and see how it goes. And they were monitoring. People were going to the beach. People were doing stuff. And they said, as far as they know, they have 0 cases of people catching it from the beach, sitting there, right, in the sun, away from each other.
That's an important point. So a very well executed study, I think it was out of China, had around 325 people tracked right back forensically to where they got it. And only 1 out of 320 something got it outdoors. And that's a fundamental reality that no one is thinking about. The blocking of people going up the mountains and on the beach is quite frankly absurd. It should just be whatever, 6 feet but it's just absurd. So that's screamingly absurd. And, you know, the rules that are made should make scientific sense. So the distancing does, the masks do, looking at the Pareto of who's most at risk, just like you said, Brian, Ireland's around 60% care homes and institutions, the deaths. Canada's the same, Sweden's the same. It's pretty much the same all over, right? So over half your issue could be dealt with by protecting that cohort. Half your issue. So it's meant to be a huge pandemic, and half of your issue was in your reach without locking anyone down. You know, think about it. So there are these absurdities. They didn't take action based on all of the fearful modeling, which came out in February or March. Everyone was talking about it. No one did anything. They waited until it had spread all over the place and Italy started getting a lot of deaths. And then when they got their own deaths, they panicked and went straight to lockdown. So the sequence is the opposite of crisis management. I mean, I've done a lot of this stuff over the last decades, not with humans, but it's the same dynamics. I just watched it like a long, slow car crash. But yeah.
So what do you think about New York's data now coming back saying 66% of new cases are from homebound people that weren't on the subways, that weren't out doing stuff?
Yeah, I think there's longer lag times than they maybe suspect. There's a lot more infection than they suspect, even with the Bronx being 41% infected and New York being 21, I think, and the state being 13 or 14. I think it way undercounts. I think they're early tests, and this thing has been all over the place and baked in. So it's not surprising that there's an overhang. This is the natural viral process. By the time they lock down, you know, it's already everywhere. And then it just will tend to continue on for the next 4 or 6 weeks, and it'll slowly fade off.
Yeah, it's like shingles, right? When someone gets shingles, the damage is already done. The virus went out. Now it's your reaction to the virus in the first place that's causing all the after effects and the damage. Now you can treat the virus already gone by the time you treat it, right? So sometimes we just lag behind, and I think that's an important thing. And here's my question: that my biggest concern was this: the lag time. So if you have someone who's asymptomatic for 2 or 3 weeks out walking around, right? Here's the question for you two smart guys. Okay, if all 3 of us are in the same room and I have COVID and you two don't, and I just got exposed and I'm not coughing, I'm not sneezing, I'm not doing anything, we're sitting there breathing the same air in the same place, what's the odds of you guys getting COVID from me without me coughing or sneezing or having any symptoms?
Well,
the data that we're seeing. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, from a Japanese documentary, they used laser tracking and modeling. It was pretty good stuff. I released it, I think, 6 weeks ago. And they showed that if people are laughing and talking and having fun, it's very significant, not a mile off a sneeze. I mean, you should see the laser interferometry, and you've got clouds of particles, each of which are kind of thousands of the virus in them. And if you spoke really slowly and delicately, okay, not so much. But they also showed that if you're outdoors, that cloud's gone. But if you're indoors in a room with a few people talking and laughing, the clouds can sit for an hour or more of the 5 micron particles. The big ones from a sneeze fall quickly, but the other ones float. So I think we know this is an R value of 3 to possibly 5 from recent studies. It's highly transmissible. So how people thought that something that was spreading in January in Europe, and they're even talking about earlier, and in America as well, they had 8% of walk-in in California in mid-February had COVID. And this is before they even started looking at distancing. An R-value virus like that is going to be all over the place, you know, and coming through March.
I think the idea of, you know, there was another interesting study that tracked the indoor versus outdoor spread, and out of like 500 cases, maybe 2 or 3 were considered to be from an outdoor exposure. So absolutely, I agree with you. Being outdoors is probably not a risk factor. So again, that shelter in place, maybe it should be, you know, stay self-isolated, feel free to go outdoors, wear a mask if needed,
Yeah.
So, that could be the potential, maybe the message of stay at home and bunker down, with all your windows closed, and be afraid of your mailman, when he drives around, Febreze the air or whatever. That's probably not the right message. I agree with you.
Yeah, and that
get
was the
out,
point.
get some sun,
And that was the point I was making. If you and I, if we were all sitting outside in the park somewhere 6 feet from each other talking, it decreased our risk significantly than to all be sitting in the same room with our household. So the problem is when you lock everyone down in the same house, there's a lot of problems, by the way, guys. The big problem is, and I'm seeing it with my patients, Tro, I know you're gonna confirm this. People are sitting at home, depressed, sad, sitting inside. They don't have enough contact. They're watching the news 24/7. They're not sleeping well. They're eating terrible food because they're stressed and they're gaining weight, and they're upset. They're not exercising. They can't go to their gym, and so we're causing them to be at higher risk. And the big thing I think that comes out of this whole thing is metabolic risk. And Ivor, I would love to hear your take on that, and also how vitamin D fits into this thing, because we're talking about you're staying inside, you're not getting vitamin D conversion either to the active form. So what's your take on all this? Because I know you've been a big you've been on the front lines talking about this. At first I shook my head and go, oh, come on, Ivor. And then I looked at the data and went, wow. And you can give us numbers on that, where having low versus high vitamin D levels, or normal vitamin D levels, say.
Oh yeah, I've done a few kind of pods with just me to the camera and slides, so I have the figures in my head. Just before I get onto that, just a real quick anecdote. I found it really challenging about the lockdown versus distancing and all what we just talked about. And I've really smart people who can't get it, even from me. And they just say, no, lockdown has to be good. Oh, we'll save lives. But one guy who is non-technical and always argues with me and always respects authority, and argued with me for years about cholesterol not being bad. He said, how can they all be wrong? All the doctors, you can't be right. And he argued about fat. How can they all be wrong? So he's an orthodox follower. But he rang me 2 days ago and he said, Ivor, what's the story with this corona thing? And I said, what do you mean? And I thought he would be the type who would say, lock yourself in your cellar. And he said, is it a load of shite? I don't want to curse here, but is this a load of crap? And I said, have you been watching my stuff? Because I was surprised he believed me. And he said, no, he had no idea about my stuff. And I said, well, how did you figure that it is? Tell me. And he says, well, I just realized the last couple of weeks in Ireland, we're one of the worst countries in Europe in deaths per million. And it's a huge fuss here, and we're locked down for weeks. I mean, it is mega lockdown. And I realized that I don't know anyone, even who knows anyone, who's even been affected, never mind died. And I said, neither do I, and neither do any of my network. And he said, well, that's what I thought. He said, this can't be like it they're saying in the papers. And I said, fair play to you, you got it. But he had more. And he said, the other thing clinched it for me. And I said, what was that? And he said, well, I like shopping a lot. Now, the stores are open for food and stuff, but not the big hardware stores and all, but there's plenty of stores open. And he said, I realized that there's all ages of staff in the stores, right up to people in their 60s. They're not just kids. And I noticed over the last 3 or 4 weeks, they're the opposite of lockdown. They're 8 or 10 hours a day with the great unwashed people flowing past them. And we know tons of those are infected. But he said none of them get sick. So if they're ultra non-lockdown and nothing's happening, then it cannot possibly be a huge issue. And I explained to him, well, it's 60% care homes, you know that, and he didn't. And I said, the rest, it's aged mainly and people with conditions. So, and he said, yeah, I just don't understand this. And I said, well, welcome to the club. Anyway, I just wanted to, it's an amazing anecdote, but he was correct. I spotted that weeks ago. In America, 3 million in the grocery workers union, they were complaining about their staff being exposed. They're not locked down at all. and they've had 41 deaths. That's 0.01%. It's lower than the average for the whole of America. And those guys are all day.
I think this just points to the fact that there's a large asymptomatic case rate.
Yeah.
There's a very large asymptomatic case rate. We see it in children, but the flip side is I have to be honest with you, talking to the people in this community, in the New York City, greater New York City area, the tri-state area here, that's been really poorly affected. Yes, we see a lot of people with metabolic syndrome, obesity, hypertension, diabetes. These are the people. Sick people get sicker, right? We know that with any disease, diabetes makes it worse. Any disease, right? You have sepsis, diabetes makes it worse. Hypertension makes it worse. Metabolic syndrome makes it worse. And COVID is no different. But then we have, patients who are, 22, 43, 54, where it just doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. So there are innocent bystanders. It's not, you were saying, yes, the overwhelming majority have this, predilection to illness. But here's the thing. Here's my fear. And I talked about this with Paul Saladino, my fear about opening the entire country up, like, hey guys, go back to normal. I don't think that'll ever happen now. I think we've had kind of permanently scarred, but the issue of being like, hey, everybody go back to normal is too much of the United States is metabolically unwell. I truly believe like this is a sick population, right? I mean, it's like an at-risk population. So I feel like the only people that potentially have no risk are like potentially young kids and maybe 20% of people, right? I mean, we say this all the time, the population is sick.
Well, Paul Mason even said, if you're over 65, it was like 2% are metabolically healthy. It's unbelievable numbers. Yeah. So we look at that, and that's the as Ivor would say, the elephant in the room, right? The elephant in the room is, look, we have to have a healthier population. This isn't a wake-up call. If it isn't, we got big issues coming.
Yeah, that's all true, guys. But remember, I have the Boston data and I regularly show it, and you got to go with the numbers. So they have, out of 2,000 deaths, they were well hit. And I appreciate, Tro, I think New York is an extreme case, being so far north after the winter. You got the super spreader, high viral load with the tubes, no preparation while it spread like hell. It kind of became a perfect storm.
Dense population.
It's a very bad example. Like, corner cases make very bad law. It is terrible what happened, and there's a lot of factors. But if you take Boston, big city, 2,000 died, big deal. And they have the data amazingly broken out on their government website. And I use it sometimes because it's very reflective of American society as well, which is, you could say, is a worst case. So their average age was 81. And from 500 sampled of people who were deceased from this, below 65, there was only a handful out of 500. I mean, the disparity between over 65 and under was truly enormous. So yes, younger people can be affected. Of course, if so many people are affected, there's always going to be younger. But the 1957 flu was vastly worse than this. And young people truly died in large numbers. So everything's, relative. The younger people as well, that brings us to the vitamin D. The problem with looking at someone who's ostensibly in their 40s and not diabetic, yeah, well, do you have their leptin? Do you have their vitamin D? Do they have a 2-hour insulin?
They're on their way.
We don't have any of this data.
Yeah, they're on their way. Let's put it this way. Majority of people are on their way. 100% agree. Yeah.
So vitamin D, just looking at vitamin D, yeah, so a study came out a couple of weeks ago, and as usual, the people who are always attacking me, the anti-low carb, anti-keto, anti-science basically, the pro-drug people, they come after me. So they didn't like when I posted on this study, and it was Philippines, 220 people analyzed. They made sure they got the vitamin D of the people 2 months to 1 year before they were admitted, to ensure that there was no acute phase reactant or the D fell because they were sick. So they were good guys, did a chi-squared test, verified that was covered. And they got approximately a 20 times higher risk of severe outcome or death if you were below 20 nanogram, and then it was medium below 30. Now, so many people are below 30 nanogram and below 20 nanogram per mil. There's huge volumes of people. So it was this huge multiplier. But then that was a small study. So I got criticized for even talking about that, right? Which is interesting in itself. And then an Indonesian study came out with 780 people. Now that's a fantastic sample from a disease. When you get all the diseased and you get to track their progress and severity and death right to the end. So the 780, this team did an even better thing. They corrected for age, sex, and even comorbidity. So they did the regression because older people tend to be lower. It might be the age that's driving the correlation. They corrected for it. Before they corrected, it was a 20 times risk of death to be low in D. And after full correction, even for comorbidity, which is a bit harsh to correct for comorbidity because that could link to the D. So it's a bit, but anyway, it was still 10 times. So we know that an associational study, the WHO are happy to say meat causes cancer from a risk ratio of 1.15. Anything below 1 or below 2.0 or 2 times is a joke. If it's above 5 times, it's really serious that you explain how there's no causality. And this was 10 times. So it's a huge correlation. Now, I gave a talk on it to explain it's not magic vitamin D, right? So I explained there's many reasons why those people with great outcomes, 20 times, 10 times safer, there's many reasons that they are over 30 nanogram, not just because they took supplements. So I went through them. One is if you eat nutrient dense, very healthy foods, meat, fish, and eggs, you'll tend to be in the over 30 group, right? So that gives you greater health and higher D. The other thing is inflammatory conditions, insulin and leptin resistance, and many other conditions will drive down your D status, independent of how much you're getting from sun, supplements, or food. So that's another reason people in the over 30 nanogram might be better or healthier because they're lacking in inflammatory chronic disease. The third thing was, I'm trying to recall now, well, I'll go to the fourth. The fourth is the sun, gives you D, nitric oxide, and a host of other photoproducts that they haven't even studied. But I'm sure if evolution designed them, they're probably important. So the sun and healthy sun exposure will tend to leave you in a higher than 30 group, right? But also give you lots of other benefits. And then finally, number 5 was supplements. So I'm a little careful with supplements because if you don't deal with the other bunch that are really important and you just jack up your number by shoving in supplements, it might not truly put you in the above 30 group that are safe, even though your number now says above 30. Do you know what I mean?
So it's a marker. It's a marker of the underlying metabolic. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, D seems to be an incredibly good marker for this particular problem. Whereas in heart disease, you know, it's pretty okay. Insulin's great, blah, blah, blah. But for this one, from the early studies, there's a third study out as well, and it says essentially the same thing. So 3 studies now, preprint, human studies. So D seems to be an amazing marker. And also we're seeing more and more patterns emerge. Like I didn't know this till I began to research it last week. Italy has the most profound vitamin D deficiency levels in Europe. I didn't know that. And every country I'm looking at is kind of lining up. You know, Japan has very, very good D status, right? Mainly they put it down to fish, but it's also probably metabolic health. So you go through all these countries and you realize the D makes sense in many ways. And also, another thing, coronaviruses have been very well studied. And some people think, oh, it's a novel coronavirus. Well, novel just means it's new. So are all the others, right? Mm-hmm. Really. So previous coronaviruses have been studied, and I have one paper studied over 3 years with humans, rates of infection and severity, 4 coronaviruses of separate types, and all of them spike in the spring in the Northern Hemisphere, and they're gone by the summer, and they come back the next year. So coronaviruses are highly seasonal, and it links directly, it would appear, among other things maybe, to UV flux. And there's a lot of influenza papers as well proposing that it's not the moisture, humidity, or temperature really. It's much more likely when you look at the patterns, it's the D status of the population, healthy sun versus bad winter. That's what tracks exactly in phase with influenzas.
Well, I think
So,
Yeah.
I think there's so much there to unpack. It's like we're trying to make sense, like we're looking at grand observations, right? And we're trying to come up with this unifying theories, right? I mean, I feel the similar way when we look at all these sick people, you know, that are getting coronavirus. I also think like, okay, there's so many other commonalities between these sick people. Healthcare workers, are they the vector for this disease? I believe they're probably the vector for this disease. Then we look at things that, you know, not just that, what are interventions that people who are sick, right? People who are sick also visit doctors. So not only are they exposing themselves to their vector, right, a main potential vector, but all those interventions that may happen by visiting that healthcare system, by being more sick, do those play a role, right? So there's a confluence of many things.
Well,
I
you know,
think it's just
Tro,
tough when
and
you look at all this and you're
yeah.
trying to make sense of it. You know,
And
it's
another
like,
thing is,
Yeah.
Tro, is what we do in our big practices. I've always thought this. I go, this is a dumb setup we have, right? Because I have 7 doctors in my practice right now, and so all of our patients are sitting there in the waiting room sneezing. One person's sick, they're all going to get it. So this is my plug for direct primary care. If you come right in and see your doctor and you're not exposed to like sick kids and people sitting in a waiting room for 20 minutes or whatever your doctor's running behind, you're setting yourself up for infection. There's no doubt about that. You go to a cramped ER with, you know, my ER is usually a 6-hour wait. Guess what? You're going to be exposed if you're sitting there. And that's what the other side of the coin is this. The ERs are empty right now because people are afraid to go in. They go, I got this chest pain, but I'm going to wait it out, right? I'm going to wait it out. I don't want to get COVID, but you're going to have a heart attack not going in to get checked out. So, you know, one of our employees came in. We've been checking everyone's temperature. She comes in with a fever. We go, oh, she's going home. And she goes, I've been having this belly pain. Turns out to be appendicitis. So the COVID scare probably saved her life maybe from rupturing her appendix because we're paranoid. We're checking everyone's temperature, right? So anyways, that's kind of there's a spectrum of all this stuff.
Yeah. So I would say I'd agree, Tro and Brian. Yeah, it's massively multi-factor. There's no doubt. I'm kind of comfortable with that because I try to be really unbiased and I just let the Pareto stack of evidence build up. Nothing is proven and it's very hard to disprove any factor. And you got tons of factors and they vary infinitely between countries, scenarios, and even small groups. But I'm okay with that. What I'm looking for intuitively, instinctively, and going through the tables is for the patterns that suggest the most important things to focus on. And you have to say there that D, which represents the nutrient-dense food, the lack of inflammation, and sun exposure, healthy and all that, it's just a big one. I'll give you another example on D, latitude, and sun, just as an example. I've been intrigued by Australia and New Zealand. Now they're in the southern hemisphere. So remember, they've just come out of a long, hot summer. Now, after a long, hot summer, all of the research on previous coronaviruses says you're not going to get hit for what it's worth. Australia and New Zealand have astonishingly low impact and they're crediting their lockdown, right? And I never believed that earlier on. 4 weeks ago, I said, it doesn't make sense because people in southern Australia were telling me we're not that locked down. So I said, there's something smelly here. And that was 2 weeks ago, I realized their southern hemisphere. So their summer has just ended. New York, far north in America, its winter has just ended. So if you look at the patterns, you know, Australia and New Zealand should be in the best place in the universe right now to not have many numbers. And guess what? They don't.
Look at most of Africa also doesn't have any, you know, so you're absolutely right. There definitely seems to be a flu-like distribution to this. You know, absolutely. The winter months are being hit harder, you know, and it's just an observation. It's like, we don't know what that means.
Well, and that would make sense with Florida and New York data because Florida doesn't have young people there. They have a lot of
California. What about by you, Brian? You're not seeing any of this, right?
Yeah.
Well, I've always thought, and we're gonna, this will bear out, and I haven't been right so far, but I still think I'm right because it's me saying this. But I think we got hit early in California. I think there was some data showing that with some autopsies that they're finding in Ventura County, for instance, San Diego, Orange County, LA, San Francisco. We had open flights from Wuhan and from China when we know people were sick. So maybe we had a less virulent form of it that hit us, or maybe it's because of the vitamin D and sun and people are more active. That's possible that we had more sun exposure before, and people are out. And because you look at the, well, gosh darn it, the is it the Bridges? What's the name of the big retirement home in Florida? But they're active people that are out doing stuff, so they're not getting hammered. Like they said, they're having 0 cases right now, right? They had a few cases early on, but none now, none. But they're out golfing and playing tennis and doing stuff, and they're maybe more fit and active and healthier than people that have been locked up in a nursing home for 8 years that have not seen the light of day, you know, that are demented or whatever. So I think that we're looking at different populations. We're looking at population density. We're looking at what's your exposure if you're out on the golf course and you're, you know, I mean, to me, the logic is, to me, it makes no sense. Like, there's a trail right behind my house. I went for a walk with my wife. I saw more people on that trail than I have in the last 10 years. It's packed with people. Why? All the other trails in the middle of nowhere where I never see a person when I'm out there. Why do we go hiking? To get away from people. I don't want to hike in a big group of people. You get away from people. That's where you're hiking with your dog and you're, you know, have a conversation with your animal, right? That kind of stuff. But the point is, people don't hike in a pack. It's just not natural. So we avoid people. If you see someone coming, you go on a different trail and you go. But what's happened now is they forced everyone onto the same trail because it's the only one that's open, right? It's the same thing when I came back from Denver. My biggest exposure in Denver, as you know, Ivor, we all stayed away from each other. No one shook hands. I gave Ivor a quick hug, but that was that's off the record. But the point is, everyone socially, because no one wants to catch it. So you're smart. You wash your hands, socially distance. You do all the right stuff. You do stuff remotely. You do what you can. But coming home, what do? They closed down every ski resort, all the stuff, all the hiking trails, everything in Denver got closed down. Guess what? The airport was packed with people. And they had fewer trains and everyone's jammed together. That's where you're going to catch it, just like the subways. So you look and say, well, the logic is, if you can socially distance and you could wear a mask and you know, all these things, I think they're all important topics to say, how do I protect myself the best? And how do we protect the most vulnerable? You sequester them for sure. There's no doubt about that.
I went through this way back in March, and I was pulling, well, I don't have hair to pull out, obviously, a bit like Tro there, but it was just stunning to me watching this car crash happen. And I still have to pinch myself at how badly it's being run. I know that sounds harsh, but it's the way it is. So, for instance, I went through smart distancing containment plan, and any major issue, we used to run big issues, $100 million losses, hundreds of millions of parts, blah, blah, blah. But the key things were, you got to get root cause, right? So you can fix it. You got to have mitigation. You know, that might be like medications, things to make the damage less in the short term. And then you've got containment. But we always focus primarily on root cause and mitigation. Now, there's a load of root cause stuff here they could be focusing on, like vitamin D. And just to let you know, selenium, which I was talking about 2 months ago, very important in terms of viral infections. We got a ton of deficiency. Just got a paper 2 days ago out of China. And there's a straight line, R squared 0.72 correlation between the selenium in the areas in China where they had poor outcomes versus much better recovery rates. It's an astonishing correlation, a bit like vitamin D. And what's more, they got all the people and they measured the selenium content in their hair, which is the way to do it. And they got similarly a straight line correlation even within the people. So now it's not that selenium is magic anymore that D is. But have you seen all the media and all the specialists saying we got to get people selenium sufficient, we got to get them D sufficient, we know hypertension's a mass. They're not talking about fixing what's causing the vast majority of the impacts. They're just obsessed with lockdowns.
I think that's a take-home message from this episode. And again, everyone, as you know, we don't give medical advice here. We're not experts on virology. We're not experts on population density and all that kind of stuff. But what we do is make observations and try to look at the data. And that's why we want to say, okay, what puts me at the most risk, right? And I think, you know, there's always anecdotal things and people talking about vitamin C, zinc. And is there anything to that, Ivor? I haven't looked at that as much as what people
I am constantly, I won't say harassed, that's very unfair. I'm constantly pushed by some followers about vitamin C, Linus Pauling. And to be honest, I looked that up a couple of years ago and I didn't spend a lot of time in it because I wasn't convinced and I moved on, but everyone wants me to go back to it. But I just don't see it. Maybe in high dose medical injected vitamin C, yes, it's been shown in human trials to have an effect on sepsis, and it probably has an effect here. But I think bunging supplements in, I just think it's not Pareto principle. It's not the big thing in the room. The D, the selenium, magnesium, all of those core things that, to be honest, we've been pushing for years for heart disease and insulin resistance anyway. They're the same set of things now, right? Avoid insulin resistance syndrome, avoid leptin resistance, you know, D, maybe K2, magnesium, maybe selenium, especially in this case. It's the same stuff you do, and fasting and keto, get your blood sugar down, your insulin down. It's the same. You know, the irony here, people could say to you, oh, you're just pushing your stuff now that there's a corona epidemic. The irony is the exact same stuff we've been pushing, right, for chronic disease abatement. It's the exact same stuff that if you did it in the next few weeks, if you're overweight and diabetic and you did a crash course, did all the right stuff, it would be the best thing you could do for yourself for corona. It's not magic, but it might reduce your risk by 3x or 4x in a few weeks. That's reasonable. That fits with the science.
Yeah, especially if you're sitting at home stressed out. Like, what can I do? Take care of yourself. Get your health right. Exercise.
Yeah.
You know, we know it boosts the immune system. We know getting out in the sun helps. We know, even if it's in your backyard away from everyone, if you don't want to go out to the hiking trails and all that, we can in California at this point. But, you know, those kind of things, you say, what can I do? Instead of sitting there and wringing your hands and being stressed out and raising your insulin level even worse and being stressed and worried. And, you know, because there is a lot of hype and there's a lot of overreaction. And like I said from the beginning, it's like, don't fear COVID, but respect it. Meaning, don't expose yourself. Don't do stupid stuff, but say, hey, look, I'm not going to live in fear of this dang thing, but I will wear a mask when I'm in a big crowd if I have to go to the store or whatever. I mean, don't take unnecessary risk, but don't sit at home wringing your hands and stressing and eating, you know, processed food all day because it makes you feel better, right? It's a problem.
Yeah, it is. And if you look, and I do remind people, and they don't like to hear it, we knew in January from China, the hypertension, COPD, and the massive age bias. We kind of had the template from China as to who is at risk. In an engineering issue management, what you would do is you'd ring fence the at-risk people or parts, and that would be the whole strategy. But in Europe, and I think to an extent in America, there was no effort to ring fence who was at most risk. A couple of months were let go by when we knew Italy had got it, and we knew it was going to spread like hell across Europe and, of course, America. And no one actually ring-fenced the at-risk. And then when the at-risk began to fall fast, then suddenly we locked down everyone, including the healthy. You couldn't make it up. But either way, I don't know. In Ireland, there was the most bizarre thing. On the 22nd of April, in the national newspaper, in lockdown, I saw two things that came out, one from the Irish government. The Irish government released 44 deaths today. The average age, I think, was 83. The median was 86. And 35 had one or multiple medical conditions. And that's the same every day in Ireland. They're the numbers. So now you know who it is. And in the same newspaper, or a different newspaper, but a main newspaper, on the same day, there was a big article about a care home worker who was saying, we're being told not to wear masks unless there's an outbreak in the home, by which stage you're 4 weeks too late at least. They were out in the news in the same day. You know exactly who's at risk, and you've got care workers not even wearing masks. So, and our politicians are up on television every night. You know, their ratings have soared because they've locked everything down, and they keep talking about having saved thousands of lives.
That's what you do from the very beginning. That's what you do you had to do that.
Yeah.
You had to.
Yeah, if they could have saved lives, but they didn't. And when they did nothing and everything fell apart, which is 4 weeks way too late. Once people start dying, it is everywhere. Then they locked everyone down, including the healthy. And then if you say to them, how come the people who are not locked down, all the store workers are experiencing no impact extra, and they're 8 hours a day with everyone coming in, and they're completely unlocked down, and there's no difference in signal there? Where do you put your lockdown now? How effective do you think it was? It's 60% in Ireland are care home deaths. Same in Canada, similar in America, same in Sweden. I mean, I don't know. I just don't know how
Well,
I don't know.
how about tying it back to Ukraine? I saw your data on the Ukraine, and they have very low
Oh,
rates of. I mean, it's unbelievably low, and it's not like they have hot weather and everything's great. What do you attribute that to, Ivor?
that one is a real stonker of a mystery. And I only really realized it because I've been fascinated by the controls. So Sweden has done no lockdown, and there's videos of their main city where they were hardest hit. And to be honest, people are still allowed to go get their hair cut. Cafes are open. People are shopping and everything. Don't even look like they're distancing much. And that was a CNN video the other day. So some
Yeah, I
people
saw
say,
that.
oh, Sweden are locking down. They're just not officially locking down. No, Stockholm is 60% of their deaths. Stockholm is their hotspot. Stockholm almost looks normal, in the street. So
Would
how
you,
are they having much
if you
less
were,
deaths?
if you were advising them, would you say, hey, wear a mask, stay away from people, and all that? How would you advise them in Sweden when they don't lock down the economy? Because I think
Yeah,
that's a
so
big question for all of us, right? All of us say, hey,
yeah,
hey, we don't want to cause a huge spike, and natural, like you said, the natural progression of, we don't treat people for the flu in July. I've never done that once in my life. We don't even think about it. It's not even on our radar, right? So when you start
no one's
looking
talking
at
about
least
it.
in California, I've never seen it once in 17 years of practice, right? So you start
Yeah.
wondering, okay, people are locked. I know companies are locked down till December already. They've already made that decision. They're locking down. They're not going to expose their sales force is not going out into the public. They're doing it all remote. And you go, wow, that's a big stinking step to take, guys. Especially the natural progression is that it's gonna drop off. I mean, if it doesn't, this is a new thing that we've never seen before, like you said.
Well, yeah, and there is no reason to believe that. The Swedish epidemiologist said this. He was challenged, but what if it doesn't come down, or what if there's blah, 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 second waves? And he said, but look, nothing is impossible, but there is no reason whatsoever with our experience for hundreds of years to expect something that never happened before to happen. In other words, why are you saying this? And the reason is there's absolute panic mongering at every turn. But yeah, the summer, the irony is now you may have Australia and New Zealand getting massive credit for lockdown when it was really they've come out of a long, hot summer. You could have people locking down another month or two and the curve falls, and it had nothing to do with the continued lockdown whatsoever, like the three professors said and everyone else. And they'll credit the lockdown as having squashed the curve. But this thing started off with a very clear logic, and I'm sure you knew it, I knew it, everyone was clear, with distancing back in March and then lockdown. It was so the hospital system would not be overwhelmed.
Exactly
Made
right.
sense.
Exactly
Everyone
right.
signed up.
And that was correct. And you
Now,
had to do that. You had to at the
yeah,
point. But then you have to
and
reassess and go, okay, guys, what's happening with the curve now? And what do we have an excess of ventilators sitting there?
yeah, but no one is reassessing because I think the politicians and everyone realized our ratings are soaring for actually locking everyone up, which is just like, oh my God, this is as good as it gets. And we're being supported by everyone to keep them locked up, you know? And why not play it safe and just keep this whole lockdown thing going? Because the economy destruction all is not our problem, and we're going to stay salaried. And we can blame the economy problems. We've got our scapegoat. It's a little piece of RNA. We're never going to take the blame for it. We saved lives.
Yeah, it's
So
a
the whole
hard
thing has
it's a hard
become
thing. It's a hard
it's
thing politically, it really is.
the jeopardy here is shocking. What's that thing you call the something jeopardy? Like in insurance, when you've got the wrong motivations by definition. You guys don't. It's
Yeah.
something, not double jeopardy, but it's anyway. There's a phrase. I'll Google it later. It means that you're incentivized perversely to do the wrong thing, and that happens in scenarios. This is the biggest one I've ever seen in my
You mean like our
lifetime.
medical system?
Yeah, exactly. I didn't want to be the one to say it, but that's exactly right. We're incentivized. And I don't know if this is true, but I've heard this that people will get paid, the hospitals will get paid way more if they put you on a ventilator versus not, as far as from government
That's
subsidy,
true.
at least in the US.
That's in the mainstream media.
So
I
it's
think
like,
it's 37 grand if you go
yeah,
on a
I heard
ventilator.
39,000 if you go on a ventilator. So
Yeah.
the hospital goes, wow, let's put them on a ventilator. I don't know. You hate to think that way, and for us, like Tro and I were saying, it's like, look, the sicker our patients get in our current system, the more we get paid as physicians. That's the sad truth of this thing. And so by us keeping people safe or preventing disease, we get paid less by the system to help save them money. It's a crazy. I know you got to go, Tro. Do you want to yap? Do you want to yap?
Nothing, guys. I got to cut
Man,
it
I'm
short,
loving
guys.
this.
I'm really sorry. You guys continue because this is awesome.
All right, man. Just for a couple minutes, Tro. We're
All right,
gonna miss you.
Thanks, Joe. See you next time. Bye.
Yeah, Ivor.
So,
It's so great to have you on it. And these things are such important topics because none of us know the right answers, and we say, okay, let's just observe and see. I'm intrigued by the Florida versus New York stuff. I really am. When you look at it, it's like Florida, at first you're like, this guy's an idiot. He's opening the beaches, letting people go outside, and they're not getting hit by that. So
yeah. Well,
you can never
and
be
you look at the
fault. It's a hard thing because people are saying I can't be faulted for locking people down and trying to prevent exposure. It makes sense. But then when you say, all you are in the same house, and if one person has it, they expose 5 people in the house. That's the big deal instead of them being out somewhere else,
Well, yeah, and that's where Sweden is extraordinary because people say, oh, they didn't lock down and they tried to. They had enormous courage to take a risk that they were reading this as a severe flu, maybe 3 times worse than the flu, and that there was no avoiding the inevitable. And they have gotten attacked and beaten all over the world because I tell you, the media and the politicians do not like someone being a control group. Now, we'll see how it turns out for them. But to be quite honest, Brian, 2 weeks ago, the reason for this we stated, it's long forgotten, but it was to make sure everyone got care and we didn't overwhelm. And the prediction was we'd be 20 times over our ICU capacity, right? What happened in Sweden is they never went over 60% of capacity. And 2 weeks ago, or April 1st to 8th, was the peak of their ICU. They've been coming down for nearly a month. So Sweden technically, without question, fully succeeded on the reason for the distancing and lockdown. The only thing is, okay, their deaths are higher, but they got hammered in nursing and care homes, and they really admit they dropped the ball there. They thought they could protect
I think that
homes.
is a huge take home is that we really have to protect the care homes. And I think, and I'll ask you, Ivor, and get your opinion on this because I respect your opinion. Say I'm just, for instance, going to be a doctor at a small school, a college that has about 300, 400 students. If they COVID test every student coming in August, and they could check IgG and IgM, whether it's an acute infection or that they were exposed and are immune already. Does that benefit the school to do that? To say, hey, look, we're going to COVID test everyone, plus we're going to check your temperature every day you come in. We have a little scanner on the wall. My wife has it in her small school that they're going to implement if they do allow us to come back to school. And every day they could check the kid's temperature. They walk by and beep, beep, without touching the thing. It's just at your elbow and it checks it. We'll see how accurate that is. But do you think that would give a benefit to that school over another school that just says, hey, we're opening the doors, everyone comes back?
Yeah, I mean that's the Taiwan model. They not only had the little point at your forehead, but they also had cameras, infrared, that would flag automatically just people walking through in a crowd. They'd beep. You know what I mean? They just infrared scan them. And that's great stuff if you need to flatten the curve more. The only question is in California, if the rates are coming down, I just wonder at how much benefit.
It's treating the brain, not the body. I think you're saying, hey, look, I'm going to be stressed about sending my kid to a school and possibly exposing him. So I think you're treating the parent more than the student to say, hey, look, is my kid safe coming back to school? And what safety precautions? Because we'll have the ability to have a test that we could do a finger stick and say, okay, positive, negative, right? Positive, negative. You had exposure already. You've already been exposed to the dang thing.
But what if you're negative? I mean, it's very frightening to think being negative for antibodies for what's essentially appears to be a severe flu in some way means you're not as safe as some other person who has them. I think it's a very dangerous discussion for society in some ways, but we won't get into that side. I think the temperature is great, and anyone who's symptomatic or shows the temperature, even if they feel okay, that's a simple little non-discriminatory kind of thing that might reassure people. It's a tricky area to get into testing and in that way.
Exactly,
now,
especially because you have false negative, false positive, those kind of things also. And so it's definitely a touchy. So it's more of a saying, hey, look, let's do everything we can, because if one kid comes in with a fever, we could catch it before he exposes his whole class, right? And then the question is like, do you wear masks indoors when you go back to school for a while? And those kind of things. How do you prevent this the safest way?
Well, you also, to an extent, if it turns the curve and is coming down, I presume in California now it's leveled off, right, and coming down.
Absolutely, yeah. And we never got hit like everyone else did. I mean, you look at the UC system. I've talked to friends in the UC system. They said they're University of California.
Well,
They're all
in the
they're sitting
young,
there bored. It's amazing.
yeah.
So Tro
So
has an absolutely different opinion than I do because of his experience is, obviously. But you say, do I
yeah,
lock down the Midwest where they're not having any cases? Like, I have friends in Colorado and their town has no cases and they're all sitting at home. It's tough. It's a
yeah,
tough one because I think what it has at some point it's going to have to be regional and saying, okay, look, are we seeing a big spike if people go to the beach? Because where I'm from, Huntington Beach, they're protesting in the streets right now because they're so pissed their beaches are closed, but the ones in San Diego are open. They're like, why are my beaches closed? Are my beaches going to infect you more than that? So some of this is political, but some of it's saying, okay, when we allowed you to go, everyone went at one time and everyone's cramming on the beach at the same time. So they're trying to avoid that. But, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing politically because no one wants to be the one who causes a big
yeah.
spike in deaths. Of course, any death is critical.
Yeah, they are all, every death's important. Everybody counts or nobody counts, but we have to be reasonable. And what that sounds to me there is a classic lack of leadership. It's a lack of any shred of leadership because, of course, they could open the beaches, assign some law enforcement officers who are probably not that busy, and if people abuse it, then they punish and they shut them for a day or two. This is basic elementary stuff. But instead, they sit on their hands. So the other thing is, if your cases are right down, then remember, the only reason any country brought in distancing and certainly lockdown, but even severe distancing, was to protect the hospital system. That criteria no longer applies in California. So until it does, and there's a rise again, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to eliminate a virus for the first time in human history? Are they trying to save every life from a virus? What's the logic now? So I give you an example. Israel. Now, Israel may have, because of their professor of mathematics who published that the lockdown had done nothing over and above the distancing. The Israeli prime minister on Monday pretty much reversed the lockdown. He even went as far as, there was a quote in the newspaper saying that kids can visit their grandparents again. We're taking away the restriction of travel completely. We're opening up businesses, but we're going to not do gyms and swimming pools until next week because they're probably pretty spready. But it's effectively reversing the lockdown. Now, I ask you as a practitioner, Brian, how can a lockdown, right, be really effective over distancing, and a few weeks later, when you've still got prevalence of the virus in your society, you can stop the lockdown? And I think the answer is they know from their own professor the lockdown didn't really do anything. So they secretly know.
And that's that is the big thing. I think there's a lot of issues at stake here, a lot of issues. But one thing is, okay, if I've been locked down for the last 6 weeks and my friend has been locked down for the last 6 weeks with no contact with anyone, if we get together, what's the odds of one of us having COVID and give it to the other? Zero. It's really zero.
Yeah.
So you look at that, it's like if you have close friends that have been on lockdown and you have, it's like, okay, so how long do you because I'll tell you, as a doc, I don't just look at you dying of COVID. I look at what else you're going to die of. And when you look at it and you go, okay, if I lock up some depressed person by themselves and they're worried that they're going to die if they breathe outside air, that causes a problem. That causes them a real problem. And again, I'm seeing it over and over. They call it the COVID-15 or something like that. People gaining 15 pounds, lockdown, stress, drinking more, doing all the opposite stuff what we're saying to do and making themselves a bigger target when they finally do go outside. So you say, how do I do this now? I'll come locked down. Okay, learn a language. Do something positive. Be like Ivor and look at all the numbers from all over the world and figure this stuff out. But do you know the number now? How many people have actually? Well, now this is an impossible question because I think there's a lot of misreporting. But now we're around in the world? How many are attributed to COVID at this point? Deaths?
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you Europe, but to be honest, America's middle of the pack for Europe, maybe a little high. And besides New York, there are special cases in Europe too of hotspots with super spread. So Europe I'll give you, because I looked at Euromomo, which is the all-cause mortality trends for 3 years, and I was quite stunned. So I'm glad you reminded me of this. So people may not be aware, but they have all countries in Europe, and they track the mortality of below 65s, above 65s, all ages. And you've got so many thousand per day die. And what happens is in the winter season, it goes up, right? And in the summer, it goes down. And that's the seasonal influenzas and indeed even coronaviruses, historical ones. Okay. So in 2018, I saw a hump in Europe and they showed deaths above the normal for the winter. And basically, if you add it up, it was around 180,000 extra deaths. I kind of got the area under the curve in 18 in the winter. So 180K. Right now, Europe is around 240K. So as of today, it's not much worse yet than the 2018 flu excess deaths, which is interesting. Now, if Europe continues the way it's going with all the curves falling and there's a dozen countries opening up their schools and reversing lockdown, Germany, Denmark, Sweden's already not locked down, Israel, that's not in Europe. But anyway, there's around 10 countries in Europe undoing lockdown. So it looks like they're heading to maybe 450,000 excess deaths in Europe. But 2018 was 180,000 excess deaths. And the interesting thing is, I asked all around, no one even knew. No one even knew that in 2018 there was 180,000 excess deaths over normal. Like they didn't even know. So in Europe, if we end up with like 2.5 or say 3 times that, it's much worse. Coronavirus is much worse. But 3 times worse than 18, and we did nothing in 18, but also we didn't even notice. I mean, someone noticed in the stats department. There was no articles.
Well,
no
and that
headlines.
may be an argument that the COVID is a little bit worse than we think, because you would think all-cause mortality would be going down. I would think in California all-cause mortality would go down. Why? Less car accidents, less motorcycle accidents, less people, falling off the bridge when they're hiking or whatever. Those kind of deaths that that would be in excess more now. People aren't out doing it. Because for me, I'd like to be the car insurance people right now are probably loving this because no one's out driving. And there's less car accidents, less people getting killed, less payouts for them, and they're getting paid still, right? So I don't know.
I kind of controlled for that, to be honest, because for 18, I took from the graphs the actual excess death seen over normal. That's 180,000. But for now, I just added up all the corona deaths and assumed every excess death was corona from the worldometer.
Oh yeah.
So it's a fair compare.
Yeah,
the 240,000 I gave you for 2020 is not from the graph with maybe less. That's just corona deaths. So I'm doing a very fair compare.
Yeah, so that that makes that point. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think there's a lot of that. So,
I mean, if you said, say in Europe, if it does turn out there's 480 or 500,000, that's the way the curves are looking over the next few months, and then we're in the summer. If that happens, are people aware it's around 3 times worse than 2018? I'm sure most people think it's 20 times worse because all the media is full.
It's a tough one. I mean, we've seen it, Ivor, and it's a hard thing because you want people to be honest, but I don't know if you saw that, but big networks were showing stuff, footage from Italy that was supposed to be New York, but it wasn't New York, it was Italy. And it was the same exact footage that they had used previously. And there's things like that are happening. You think, gosh, they're really trying to make people worry. And it's hard because you don't want people to be lackadaisical and do stupid stuff and put themselves at risk and put our healthcare workers at risk, because all my friends are on the front lines, And so be smart, but don't be paranoid. I think that's the kind of the take home is saying, hey, do what you can and protect yourself. And I think,
and follow the rules. So right now we are talking about the mathematics and the reality of how effective they are. But at the end of the day, I haven't really left the house hardly in 6 or 7 weeks. Ireland has chosen to do a certain strategy. So for everyone, you honored the strategy. But you should also discuss the strategy and talk to your local, officials and discuss it openly online.
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean you all say, let's all run out and spit on each other. Obviously, but no, you follow the rules for your country and for your lawmakers. but you also got to keep them honest and ask the questions, especially database questions, like I said. But I noticed, Brian, the good thing, when I started talking around this data, people actually didn't like me even talking about it. And that's changed.
Well,
So I noticed, which is very good for the future and for freedoms and for us as a species, people are beginning to get more rational, I think.
yeah, I
And
think
the
that's it. And it's
media,
emotional. When you're emotional, you get your emotions
oh,
involved and it gets out of whack. I
wrong.
mean, they just lose all reason rather than saying, okay, let me reassess. And that's why I think, as with low carb, with all these things, I had to reassess and look at my success and what my patients were doing and say, okay, I've been saying one thing for all these years. It's not right. It's not working. Let's change what we're doing. So I think at some point you look at that. I think in New York, Cuomo must be saying, wait a minute, 66% of our new admissions are people that were locked down, legitimately locked down, not on the subway, not doing. So it's
Yeah.
like, it's spreading in the house. Maybe we need to have people sit outside by themselves or do whatever. I mean, get out in the sun and vitamin D data. I mean, all these things you start looking and say, okay, we reacted, but now do we have to reassess? And I think that's what we're all saying. And obviously we're not giving advice to people out there, but we're saying, look, think about it logically and say, what are my chances of being exposed if I'm out hiking on a trail and there's no one within 100 yards of me? What's the odds of any of that stuff? And I've seen some other data that just in a medical journal yesterday, an infectious disease journal, they were saying they were checking for COVID on masks of people that, were exposed for sure. And that they weren't picking up the virus or that it was, from that. So anyways, I don't know, but I'm just saying there's a lot of different, ideas out there. So, everyone has an opinion, but I think at some point you have to sit back and say, okay, what's happening and where are we seeing the results? And when you start looking at stuff like that, like Florida and New York, you say, why are they so different? Could it be different strains? Absolutely. Then maybe that's it, Ivor. Maybe that's part of it, that we got hit with a weaker strain in California early, and then they got these nasty ones that came to New York. I don't know. But
Yeah,
policies, there's a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah, in engineering crisis management and escalation leadership, which was my thing, complex multi-factor problems that have gone out into the customer in the field all over the world. And it's just as, well, okay, it's not the exact same, but it's similar chaos. I mean, months of round-the-clock working, huge amounts of money potentially going to be lost, and so complex, multi-causes coming together to cause a 6-month lag time product failures in the field, and then they ramp up just like this. And by the time you know, it's too late, and then you've got to frantically scramble to manage your inventory. It's the same thing, but we use integration. And what you just said there, Brian, we have to be really good, without having the answers, to integrate every piece of data and rack and stack the most likely best paths forward, and then do those as effectively as we can. And I think that precisely is what's missing so far in this. But hopefully the curves will come down now and people will begin to openly discuss. I mean, those 3 professors I mentioned, they only got 1 article each, and they were forgotten immediately.
And they took a lot of heat, and a lot of, they took a lot of heat
gone.
because they were speaking outside of what everyone was saying. And so when you stand out, and the thing is, having some people like, it's one of those things. You could argue either way. You could say that the governor of Florida was brilliant, or he was an idiot and got lucky. I mean, depending on what position you want to take. But what you still have to do is look at the data and go, okay, did everyone who went to the beach have spikes? They didn't see it. So you say, okay, does that mean in California this? Maybe not. Maybe in New York it won't. They'll have a huge spike. So you have to look by case basis. But when you look at the logic and say, this thing hates heat, right? We know that it's not going to survive in the middle of the desert, right, for a week on a cactus. So it's those things you say, okay, if I'm in heat, and I'm not in heat, but out in the warmer weather, my odds are way lower. So I think it's one of those things you have to do a situation by situation, case by case. I think that we have a lot of things we've learned, but again, it all bounces back to what you're saying, is like looking at your metabolic health is what is probably the biggest determiner of whether you live or die when you get it, if you get it. Huge. Right? And we don't even know. And you may say, yeah, you're less likely to actually get it, or are you just less likely to have a bad outcome, right?
Oh, it's the outcome primarily. I think, look, a lot of epidemiologists are kind of saying, look, everyone's going to get it pretty much over time. The vaccines are just they've 30 years working on coronavirus vaccines, and they've never had one successful in humans because of the nature mechanism. We won't get into it.
Yeah, the RNA virus. It's a nasty one, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and well, funny enough, coronavirus is the common cold
Exactly
family.
right. Yeah, people don't
So
realize that.
usually,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
usually coronavirus is the common cold, so it's not as bad as influenza. But this coronavirus, years go by, it happens to be more transmissible and more severe. It doesn't make it magic. It's just it got lucky to, in terms of it's a bad one. But I huge sympathy for New York when I saw the figures coming out. So again, this is not about the terrible things that have happened in certain scenarios. And every local area has to manage its situation, just like you said, because it's going to have loads of different factors. So one area of the country may be lucky. They've got a low curve, even though they're not controlling it much. They don't need controls and they slowly pass through it. And then you got New York in the other extreme and Italian towns in the north of Italy. So
And
yeah,
I'm sure
I
you
guess I
saw
just
that
agree.
that
Yeah.
town Vo was, I think they had the first corona death that was documented. They just locked down, they tested people, and they sequestered people that were sick, and they had no more cases. I mean, no more deaths from that. Yeah, but it's
Yeah,
a small
but
town, and they could do that. But Los Angeles trying to do that, it's a different story, right? But
yeah, you can't across Europe. And well, one of the last things I'd say as well, the scariest thing about this for me, it's obviously tragic for so many people, but the scary thing is this phrase, the new normal. And a brilliant epidemiologist said in an interview I saw the other day, he said, what is this about the new normal? Why will there be a new normal? This virus will behave and is behaving like all viruses. It's more severe than influenza, but it will pass through. There may be some waves next winter. But what do you mean new normal? Why? And I just thought it was a very powerful question because I can ask the same question myself. Yeah, there'll be a new normal that when another virus comes along, another flu that's bad or something like this, of course we're going to be smarter. We're going to put on masks earlier and clean surfaces and hands like we never bothered doing before. We're going to monitor it better. And if it gets more severe, we'll do smart, common sense things because now we're going to be experts. But there shouldn't be a new normal in terms of any restriction in the future on flights, on football matches, on any things the human do should not change when this passes until there's a new problem that's obvious, but we'll react to it smartly. But I really fear this idea, there'll be a new normal in general. No, there won't. We'll be more careful with hygiene. And when a flu comes along, it'll be caught by our technical experts. They'll see it coming like they did this. They saw this 2.5 months before we even did a single action. So the new normal will be we'll react better. But do you find, Brian, that this idea that humanity has changed by something that may turn out to be 3 times worse than the flu in 18, that humanity will be changed forever?
yeah, I
How
think
does that strike
that's
you?
the scary thought. That's a scary
That's
thought.
scary.
Because, and the scarier thought is this, Ivor, and this is the real, for me as a doc, if my patient dies, they die. It doesn't matter. It's like, oh, at least he didn't have a heart attack. He died of COVID. Or you don't say that. You say, oh, gosh, that was tragic.
Yeah.
The point is, I think that the most current number, and you probably know better than I, 11 million people die a year of diabetes complications, right? 11 million people. And we're talking about maybe 200,000 or 300,000. Is that where we're at now? I don't even know the numbers on COVID or what.
A few 100,000 is
Say
where,
it was,
and it'll go.
say it was a million. Say it was a million, like way more at worst case scenario. That is dwarfed by our 11 million that are going to die of diabetes complications and everything else. And so what I have to do is look at the big picture and say, okay, if I'm going to have a bad outcome, I want to put myself in the best neighborhood of not having a bad outcome. How do I do that? Well, be as healthy and fit as you can, and don't stress and don't worry. And so the worst thing you could do is what we're doing, in my opinion, of being stressed out, sitting at home, eating terrible food, not exercising, isolating from everyone that you love, and not going to your places of faith, even if you spread out like crazy. And so there's a lot of things that are big questions, and you say, okay, how do we get back to our normal? And Ivor, I can't let you escape, and I know we went over because I got you, man. I'm not gonna let you go until I get every ounce of wisdom out of you. But I saw you post something about a new at-home insulin test, and I'm very intrigued by it. So maybe you can give us a couple-minute bullet on that, because I'm that's something as a doc that if you want to talk about prevention, that is massive. That's a massive deal. So what is this thing, and how do I get it when I want it?
Yeah, no, great, Brian. And I would have possibly forgotten. So it's Meterbolic, Meterbolic, and it'll be the world's first home insulin meter. And I believe it'll be able to measure C-peptide and the cholesterols and a whole range of things. And right now it's early days. So they're looking for maybe 50 or 60 early adopters to get in and do the final polishing and development of the technology. So it's not actually just there to be purchased, but it is being launched this week. And it's essentially the first manifestation is you prick your finger like a blood glucose meter, you squeeze a little blood into a little glass or tube thing. Little more blood than a glucose meter is needed, but you put it into a little plastic disposable item and the phone can read it. It fluoresces. It causes a fluorescence based on your insulin level. So your phone can read your insulin and track, and there's an app. So I'll send a link if you're sending this out straight to the page, but they're mainly looking for early adopters now, but people can sign up with their email to be on the list. And yeah, they're getting into the launch phase.
Yeah, I would love to look at that and compare it to what my labs shows, because that's a lot of people I get. And the reason it's exciting because there's so many people that contact us say, hey, my doctor won't order an insulin level on me, and if they could do it themselves and just order and do it, that is pretty cool. And for doctors who understand this stuff, and then you could say, okay, because we always talk about this with artificial sweeteners is a perfect example, and people say, well, my sugars don't rise when there's no sugar in that, but what happens is your insulin may rise like crazy. And if we're talking about insulin being a big problem with all COVID and all these diseases, I want to keep my insulin as low as I can, right? And being healthy with my sugars and all that. So when you start understanding, oh, it may not raise my sugars crazy, but my insulin goes nuts when I eat certain foods, because it's intriguing, the science and how we're individuals and how we react to certain fruits and vegetables and things like that, or different foods, so that's really a cool thing.
Yeah, no, it should be amazing. And again, bit of development to go, but it should be amazing. And the only other last thing is we have a new movie coming out, or it has come out. It's $3.99 to stream or $9.99 to download and own. And it's at extratimemovie.com. So we scan 45 with a calcium scan, Irish sports stars who are in their 50s now. And they were all healthy and the doc said they were fine. And we picked up 9 people. Several have had to have bypasses since. Huge calcium scores.
Wow.
But we also intervened with the very thing we talk about, Brian, the low carb, the blood glucose meter, eliminating the bad processed food, maybe vitamin D and K2 and potassium and magnesium. But anyway, one guy with a huge score said, I want to take this on. So a lot of the movie is his hero's journey with a big score. And at the end of the movie, we scan him a second time. And let's say,
what's the dang movie? Now I'm gonna have to watch it. What is it called?
It's called Extra Time, but the website is extratimemovie.com, all one word .com.
All right, man. I'm gonna get smarter this weekend. I'll get that. Yeah, good.
I'll send you a link anyway. But if people could help us, I just always say it that we put a lot into it, a year and a half, and if people could stream, download, but especially share if they like it, and it'll just help us get the message out on saving lives, to be quite honest.
Yeah, you're the one who converted me over on the coronary calcium. I remember sitting there thinking, this nutty guy, I hope he's smarter and whatever. But that was a long time ago, so I had less gray hairs. But Ivor, thank you. Some of my patients, I'm convinced they got saved by a coronary calcium score. Looking at that and just knowing their numbers, know your numbers, like you say. And everyone listen to the Fat Emperor podcast. It's my favorite. I love it. Don't tell Tro, but I do. And Ivor, I love that you're out there doing stuff, and you took a stand, and really I respect that. I know that you and Dave Feldman were having a difference of opinion and all that, but it's great that you can have a dialogue and say, okay, look, I think in America, like what you're saying, that my biggest concern is no one wants to hear a dissenting voice. If you say, hey guys, here's what the data shows, and you actually know your data. There's a lot of people who say dumb stuff that, you say that's a bad. So if you were wrong over and over, I'd say, well, I'm not going to listen to Ivor anymore. But I think you took a strong stand, and you were correct. And my leaning was towards what you were saying. And I was like, gosh, I wonder if we'll see. Only time, because you couldn't say, no one knew. We've never seen anything like this. So, but I think when you say, let's look at the data, let's reassess, I'll get back to you. I'm not 100, I don't know, but let's see. But I think with the test of time, what you were saying is the most accurate of anyone I've seen out there, right? Is there
Yeah,
anything
well,
now in retrospect that you would say, yeah, I'll take that one back, or do you think like you're still standing by what?
It's just because, and again, I've just spent decades with issues like this leading them when there were obviously not life at stake, but fairly high stakes and enormous pressure. And like Tucker Goodrich, he called it also correctly, largely, but he spent 20 years as a risk manager in chaotic environments. So it's just lucky of having the experience with lag time, complex multi-factor issues, and just being able to read the data and having an intuition to seeing where it's probably going. It's not magic, but it's very rare quality, it appears. But listen, it's not over yet. We'll see what happens. But I will say one last thing to your listeners. The people who attacked us and pushed back for discussing the data, right? That to me is kind of like an environment that's a certain political system. So I think Americans particularly might be useful to hear this. To me, people who push back against discussing data openly, they're kind of like communist. That's the way I'd view them.
Yeah, I think, and that's it. And you don't want to give a huge soapbox to people who are saying crazy outland. I've heard, crazy stuff that's dangerous, and you go, okay, that's dangerous and scary. But if you don't know, and people don't know when it's up in the air, and you go, okay, let's look and see, let's reassess, and you're looking at data, not just saying how you feel about something. I think that's it, and that's what I've always respected, is that you do that. And then I love that you always talk about root cause, because we have to look at the root cause of like, okay, what is going to kill me if I get this thing? Being metabolically sick and being older, really, if you're in a nursing home or all those things. We know that. I mean, that's not questionable. That's just what we see. And so when you break the numbers down and you say, okay, this is what we're seeing. And then, I think it's just, this is such a huge, important topic. It transcends just talking about metabolic disease and all these things. You say, okay, as a society, what is acceptable? What is not acceptable? What am I willing to give up to be safe, to save my grandma, my grandpa, my mom and dad, right? And my kids. So you say, how do we be as safe as we can and still have some quality of life where we can decrease our risk? Because I'm telling you, for me, I was just out last weekend in San Diego, and it was a beautiful day, and I saw guys out golfing and doing. I was like, wow, it was so beautiful to see that. Even though they're social distancing and they're not in carts together, they're walking separately, but it's just really nice to see people like out seeing the sun and moving again and living life, because I think we're going to see ramifications of depression, anxiety, stress, and we know it. I'm seeing it already, and weight gain and depression and people feeling isolated. That's the worst thing we could possibly do right now. So I think, again, my advice would be reach out to people, help them. If there's seniors that you want to protect, go out shopping and do whatever you can and be a positive influence. That's never going to hurt you. Being metabolically healthy is never going to hurt you. There's no data saying that, hey, that poor guy was healthy, so he died. I mean, healthy people can die of weird stuff, but it puts you at a much, much lower risk. So what we're all interested in is lowering our risk of lowering the risk is all you can do. And that's what you're talking about, Ivor. And hopefully with the podcast, I think this is a huge one for people just to sit back and reassess, because the most dangerous person to me is the one who will not change what they believe based on facts. You look at Tim Noakes and all these people that we uphold, because they changed their view based on data and what they saw clinically or what they saw in life experience. And I think having that, if we just stick to our dogma and we can't be flexible, and those of us in the low carb community are always accused of being inflexible, but I say we have to step back and look at the data, and if it changes, we change with it, right? We're not tied to this stuff.
Absolutely. And I've got relations who are elderly who have diabetes and stents and heart conditions. I've been advising them a bit, but people need to remember too that someone who's data centric, raising data that feels uncomfortable when you're scared, because there is an element of hysteria, and humans are programmed to fear contagion. It's an evolutionary thing, like fear of snakes and spiders, danger. It's built into humans deeply. That's a lot of what we're seeing. But when I discuss the data, exactly, I mean, I've got relations. My mother's 80 down the road. So people need to remember, I've got people I care about too. And of course I care about everyone, but we have to honor the data and know what technically is going on, separate from the emotion, so we make the best choices to best look after people. Yeah, so that's last words probably on the matter.
Yeah, Ivor, hey, thanks for joining us. It was such an honor. It's always great. Love your podcast. Love all you're doing. The Fat Emperor podcast. If you're bored, listen to you're locked down. You might as well listen. He's got videos everywhere. great information and great guests and everything. So keep up the good work, Ivor, and thanks for joining us on short notice. I begged you to come on. I appreciate you coming, and it's always good to see you, man. Hopefully we get together soon, and hopefully we don't have a new social norm that I can't give you a hug when I see you next time. So
this will pass. Thanks a lot, Brian.
All right,
you
brother.
guys are fantastic.
Take care.
Bye
Have a
now.
good one, man.
Bye.